Hi everyone, welcome to Knitting 101 with Debbie, and this is our second lesson. Today we're going to be talking all about knitting needles. We're going to be talking about the different kinds of knitting needles, what materials they're made out of, and the different sizes, and how to choose the best set for your project. There are three different kinds of knitting needles. There is straight knitting needles, which are exactly how they sound. They're straight, they have a point at one end, and you usually knit with sets of two. There are double pointed knitting needles, and they have a point at each end, and usually you are knitting with 4 or more at a time. And then there are circular knitting needles, which are two shorter needles connected by a cord. And we're going to go into each one of these in more details, and I have examples and when you would use each one of these types of needles for your project. So first we're going to be talking about straight knitting needles. And I have a couple different packages here. These are the most common length of straight knitting needles. I would say these are probably, I'm trying to see if it has a length on here, 10 inches. These are 10-inch knitting needles, and these are the most common length. They're pretty manageable, pretty easy to knit with. And of course they come in pairs. I have a set because a lot of times I'm knitting a variety of patterns that come in different, that you need different knitting needle sizes for. The other length I have, and these are 14 inches. So I know it's kind of hard to see on the camera, but these are 14 inches, and these are probably the longest knitting needles that they have. And the reason is because when you're knitting with them, it can get cumbersome because they're just a little bit too long. But if you have a lot of stitches and you want to use this longer knitting needle, you can. So these are wood. We're going to talk about the different types and materials of knitting needles. I'm going to show you a couple other sets of straight knitting needles that I have. Before we move on, there are these. This is actually my first set of knitting needles, and I got these at a craft store. They were relatively inexpensive, and they're made of plastic. So straight knitting needles are really good for beginners and learning how to knit. And they're good for scarves, which that's going to be the first knitting pattern that I teach you, is how to create a scarf, because that's usually where most knitters begin. And so you just have the stitches on the knitting needle and you just work back and forth. And they're also good for straight patterns. So think about if sometimes when you're creating a sweater, you'll create the pieces and then stitch it together. So that would be what straight knitting needles were for too. These are size 50 knitting needles. They're gigantic, and this was for, remember last week when we talked about, or the last video when we talked about that bulky weight yarn. This is for really big, thick yarn, or if you want to have a very, very loose pattern. So when you knit with these, your knitting pattern comes together rather quickly because they are so big. And then the last set I have over here, this was also one of my first sets. These are nickel plated, and I got these at a craft store as well. So that's just a little bit on straight knitting needles. Okay, now we're going to talk about double pointed knitting needles. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on these because this is really for the advanced knitter. If you think about socks or smaller garments that you knit in the round, so it's one continuous round, that's what double pointed knitting needles are for. And so they come in sets like this. You can buy them by the size too if you want to, but usually it's 5. Most patterns that I've seen with double pointed knitting needles just call for 4. So if you think about, you have stitches on this needle, then you have stitches on this needle, stitches on this needle, and on this needle, and of course there'd be some overlap, so it'd be more like this, and then you just kind of knit around and around and around. And that's when, if you think about it, when you get a sleeve at the top of your arm, starts out rather a little bit bigger and then gets progressively smaller as you get down to the cuff, you would put them on double pointed knitting needles. And also for socks, mittens, anything that's a little bit on the smaller end of things. I am still learning about double pointed knitting needles. I understand the theory, but I have not mastered knitting with double pointed knitting needles yet. So maybe in a future lesson, a couple of years down the road, I can show you how to knit with double pointed knitting needles. Or maybe there's someone out there in our library audience, our patrons, that knows how to knit with double pointed knitting needles and is willing to show me. So, okay, so let's talk about circular knitting needles. So this is probably, these types of knitting needles are the most common. They're the best to use for pretty much any kind of project, whether you're knitting in the round, whether you're knitting straight. And so you can work straight projects with circular knitting needles, or you can work in the round. And I'll kind of explain it as best that I can. So if you remember, let me show you how to put these together. So again, I have packs of knitting needles. I kind of am a hoarder, so I collect a lot of them. I see really cool sets and pretty colors, and I like to buy them. So let me pull a couple out. So as you can see from the straight knitting needles, they are a lot shorter. They are probably 4 inches, I would say. But when you add them to a cord, which is what you're supposed to do, they become a lot longer. So I just got done knitting a sweater, and I was wearing it at the library the other day, and I got a lot of compliments on it, which made me happy. But what I had to do is I had to knit straight, but it was a cardigan sweater that went all the way down my knees, and I had to knit the entire collar. So from one knee all the way up around the back of my neck and down to the other knee. So it was really, really long. I think it was about 400 stitches. And there was no way there was a straight needle long enough to do that. And so I had a really long cord. All right, so how you work this is usually there's a pack, and I'll show you what these little round things are for in a minute. And it comes with a key, and the key, let me see, it looks like this. It's got a round end to it. There's a hole on the cord, and so you use that to thread your knitting needle and to tighten it. Now I usually tighten it really good, and the reason is because the first few times I used these knitting needles, these circular knitting needles, I thought, oh, I don't really need that key, I don't need to tighten it. I just tightened it by hand, and about, I don't know, 30 or 40 rows in, I was probably a good halfway through my project, they came unscrewed. One of the knitting needles came off, and all my loops came off, all my stitches. So now if you look at this, which is kind of hard to see in my camera view, it's much longer. So you could do a much longer project. So you could do more stitches on this. And then it's also good for knitting in the round. So just imagine you use 2 sets of circular needles, but imagine a project maybe that's a little bit bigger, like a sweater, that you're knitting around in a circle and you don't have a seam. Okay? And what these are for is a lot of times patterns will call for you to leave the stitches on scrap yarn or you have to change out knitting needle sizes. So for example, if you start out with small on maybe a cuff or a hem, and then you go to a larger knitting needle, you need to have your stitches stay on as you change knitting needle sizes. So imagine that we have stitches on this cord, and so on each end I put one of these. I think these are so nifty. And they just screw right on. And then your stitches won't come off because this cap is on there. So if you have to hold your stitches, and you put one on the other end as well. And then you have your stitches on here and they won't come off because you have this cap on there. So circular knitting needles, really good way to go. When I was learning how to knit, I have a friend who's an expert knitter, and she said the sooner you can learn to knit on circular knitting needles, even for a straight project, the better knitter you will be. So I highly encourage you, we can start when you are making the scarf, you can start on straight knitting needles, but I strongly encourage you to move to circular knitting needles so you learn how to knit with them, the feel of them, all of that as you're going into the bigger projects. Now we're going to talk about different sizes of knitting needles and how to best decide what size of knitting needle for your pattern. So as you've seen with my kits or my packets of needles, they all have different sizes in them, and these are standard sizes, and so they go from, at least these packets, US 11, which is 8mm, down to US 4, which is 3.5mm, and that's pretty standard with any kind of knitting needle set that you get. Like I said, you can always buy them a la carte. You can go to craft stores and buy them a la carte. You can go, I know a lot of my stuff is from Knit Picks. Another good one is yarn.com. That's Webs. They have a lot of knitting needles as well, so I've gotten a few from them. So this is another pack that has different sizes in it. So you've seen that. You've seen my Gigantor size 50s. And I mean, just basically, I bought those by themselves. These are 25s because this was another pattern I was working on. Actually, these are 19s. And so I bought these individually at a craft store. Okay, so they come in all sizes. So I think even these 50s, I've seen bigger at the craft store. I've also seen people make their own out of dowels and that sort of thing. So, and I've also seen finger knitting, although I haven't figured out how to do that yet, but if you've seen that, I've seen that on social media. So there's a couple different ways. One is if you are working off a pattern. Most patterns will tell you, all patterns should tell you what size knitting needle you need. So we're going to look at this pattern, and I'm going to try and get it close enough. So in the first page of the pattern, it tells you your finished measurements, so what the different sizes are. So it'll have a size range, and then it will tell you what kind of yarn you need. And you know what? I don't necessarily always go with the yarn that they choose. I go with the weight. But again, if you go back to the yarn presentation, I go into the store and I touch and feel and decide what I think is going to feel good next to my skin, especially when I'm creating a sweater or a scarf, because scarves go against your neck. So a hat, maybe not so much, but I like to choose my yarn that way. And then in this bottom one, it says needles, and it says US 8 straight needles, and then it has US 7 straight or circular needles. So what's going to happen, the reason there's two different sizes, is if you look at the pattern, those cuffs and that hem is going to be knitted with a smaller needle, and then as you get into the body of the garment, it's going to go to the larger needle just to make the stitches a little bit bigger, make the garment a little bit looser. That's how you get those nice tight cuffs. So usually I see 2 sizes down for cuffs, but sometimes it's only 1. And for this pattern, it's only 1. So this is going to be a looser cuff. So that's where you get those from your pattern. They're usually on the first page. And the second place is, let's say you find some yarn and you're just going to knit a scarf or something that is pretty easy to knit, and so you don't really need a pattern. If you go onto the label, I'm going to try and get this on my camera. If you look right under that worsted weight, it says 7 to 8 needles. So that's US size 7 to 8 needles. Okay, so it will tell you, most yarn, when you buy it at a yarn store, will tell you what size needles are best for this yarn. So if you're knitting a scarf and you just want normal size stitches for the yarn, you can go with that. If you want looser stitches, so you want to have more gaps and kind of a looser garment, you go with bigger needles. If you wanted to have tighter stitches and smaller, like no gaps, then you would go with maybe a little bit smaller needles. Okay, so you don't have to go with the needles that are recommended. This is just what size if you want to have standard stitches. Okay, and I also will say about the patterns, there are sweaters that I have knitted that I wanted it to be a little bit looser, maybe a little bit lighter, so I, used bigger needles for that kind of a pattern. Even though the pattern called for smaller needles, I went with a little bit bigger just so my stitches would be a little bit looser and the garment would be a little bit lighter and more flowy, I guess. You just have to, as you become more experienced with knitting, you can make those adjustments on your own, and they're pretty easy to do. We're going to talk about knitting needle materials now and which ones are best for where you're at with a knitting project and how advanced or experienced you are with knitting. Okay, so the first one I'm going to talk about is plastic, and these are the most economical. If you're a really beginning knitter and you're not sure, you really want to, you're going to take up the craft and keep knitting long term, these are a good way to go because you're not putting in a huge investment into your knitting needles. Because trust me, we have knitting needles that are from a Hyundai all the way up to a BMW or a Mercedes. So these are, not to say the Hyundai isn't as good as a BMW or a Mercedes, I'm just saying that the price is a lot different depending on what you buy. So these are plastic knitting needles. They are very good for the beginner. One thing that I will tell you is that they have a very dull tip, so it is more challenging to knit with plastic knitting needles. So what I would recommend is, if you're going to use plastic knitting needles to start out, go with larger. So these types. Don't go with real small knitting needles where you're going to have small stitches, because you're going to get frustrated because the tips are very dull. And that is true of any of my plastic knitting needles. So let me pull these back out. That's a very rounded tip, so it's harder to knit with these kind of knitting needles. But again, super economical. I think I got these for like $3 at Joann's. So not very expensive at all, and that was when I was first starting out. I wasn't sure I was going to keep knitting long term. So wood or bamboo. These are excellent for new beginning knitters, and in fact most of my knitting needles are wood, and it's just my preferred material. The tips of the needles stay relatively sharp. Like, I've used these for years and years, and they've still got really good tips on them. The other reason they're really good for beginners, because there's a little bit of, I don't want to call it tack, but the stitches don't slide off as quick. So if you're trying to figure out your knitting technique, and as you're doing that, sometimes your knitting will slide off the needle, well, with wood, it stays in place a little bit better. Knitting is a little bit slower with these, just a little bit, but these are really good. And all around, again, I mean, I knit constantly, and I have 2 or 3 projects going at the same time. I would say 95% of all of my projects have been knit with wood knitting needles. Okay, so there is my endorsement for wood knitting needles. Last one is nickel plated. And let me tell you the pros and cons of nickel plated. Nickel plated, I have another set over here. Actually, I have a couple different sets. Here, I've already showed you this one. These are pricey. These are a little bit more expensive. So nickel plated are more expensive knitting needles. These are pretty economical. You can get them at the store, although they are going to be more than the plastic knitting needles. Knitting goes very fast with these because they're very smooth, and you know, it just kind of, they glide together very, very well. But for the beginner, these aren't great because they are so smooth. You have to be very careful or your stitches will slide right off the needle. When I've been using my nickel plated circular knitting needles, I can't tell you how many times my stitches, you know, if I'm not paying attention, stitches will slide right off, just because these are so smooth. They feel a lot different than wood knitting needles. So you need to be a little bit more advanced before you start using these. But I like nickel plated when I'm creating a garment that is really long. Like if I was going to knit a scarf right now where I just wanted to, you know, get it done real quick, or I was creating a sweater that was, you know, a little bit longer, and you know, or a shawl, something where I was knitting a lot of stitches and I wanted to go faster, I would use nickel plated because the knitting does go by. It does go a little bit faster just because they slide a little bit better, and the tips stay pretty pointed. I mean, they don't wear down like the wood ones wear down a little bit, and plastic, they just don't even come. You can't even buy them with sharp points. Okay, so that is my take on the different materials used to create knitting needles. So here are just a few tips for choosing the right knitting needles. The first is follow the pattern. Most patterns are going to tell you what kind of knitting needles and what sizes to use. So they'll tell you if you need straight, if you need circular, or both, and what sizes you need to use. And also use the size of knitting needle the pattern or the yarn calls for. And this is at the beginning. I know I gave you a few tips for things that I do, but I have been knitting for a long time, and so I've made those adjustments, but I did not do that when I was first starting out. So as a beginning knitter, make sure that you follow and use the knitting needle sizes that the yarn or pattern calls for. You can experiment with different kinds of needles. You can use the plastic or the nickel plated or the wood and kind of decide which ones feel best to you. Okay, like I said before, that most beginning knitters use wood or bamboo because the stitches are less likely to slide off, but it is entirely up to you. And then straight knitting needles are the easiest to knit on. But if you are going to make knitting a lifelong hobby, I would recommend that you learn how to knit on circular knitting needles sooner rather than later and get comfortable with them, because they are the ones that you will be using most often. All right, so that is our lesson 2 all about knitting needles. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email, call the library, or come and see me. I would love to talk knitting with any of you who are interested in talking to me about that. All right, have a great day, everyone. Bye.